Day of the Dead Moon, Part 5.
The British victory at Rorke's Drift did a little to maintain morale, but nothing could disguise the indignity of the momentous defeat at Ulundi. British prestige in South Africa had been dealt a devastating blow, and even now there was some grumbling in the Transvaal, which had been annexed as part of Carnarvon's plan. The Boer logic was impeccable. If the Boers could defeat the Zulus at Blood River in 1838, killing 3,000 of them without losing a man, and if similarly armed Zulus could smash a modern British army, surely the Boers could defeat the British. Eventually, this grumbling manifested itself in military action, and the British suffered another terrible defeat at the Battle of Majuba in 1881. But that is another long story. You will remember that Lord Chelmsford's plan in 1879 was to invade Zululand with 3 huge columns and 2 small columns. On expiry of the ultimatum, Colonel Pearson had crossed the Tugela at the lower drift with number 1 column. He was attacked by a large impi while on the move at a place called Inyazan. While the British force at Ulundi was being destroyed by that great Zulu army, Pearson enjoyed a military success. The Zulus at Inyazan failed to synchronize their attack properly and were driven off with heavy losses. Midshipman Coker puts the newly invented Gatling gun to use for the first time in history. Pearson was lucky. He proceeded to the mission station at Ishowe and was then promptly besieged by the Zulus. Who would ever have thought that a modern British army could remain besieged by the Zulus for 10 weeks? Chelmsford was devastated. After his eerie march from Ulundi to Rorke's Drift in that terrible dawn of the 23rd of January 1879, after his sullen defeated column had passed so close to the sullen defeated Zulu force that had attacked Rorke's Drift, Chelmsford had the unenviable task of having to ride immediately for Pietermaritzburg. He and his arch-conniver of the Zulu War, Sir Bartle Frere, would have to draft a suitable telegraph to Sir Michael Hicks Beach in London. They had to inform the Colonial Secretary that this most powerful force that had ever been fielded in these colonies had been thoroughly trounced by this bunch of savages armed with sticks. It reads, "The telegrams which will reach you by the mail will have given the leading facts of the disaster when the camp at Ulundi was surprised by an overwhelming force of Zulus. There appears to be no doubt that the Zulu force took the camp by surprise. Our men were surrounded and fairly overwhelmed by force of numbers. Every witness speaks of the desperate courage with which the men fought to the last. They were destroyed where they stood, with the exception of a few who managed to escape and swim the river. The extreme excitement caused in this colony by this misfortune and the difficulty of transport, which is greater than anticipated, will probably cause some change in the disposition of the Lieutenant General's forces and delay in movement." Chelmsford requests the Secretary of State for War for a man with the rank of Major General to come out to South Africa without delay. He complained that the strain of prolonged anxiety, physical and mental, that had been telling on him before the Zulu War was becoming unbearable. He added that Frere concurred and wanted this replacement to be able to take over Frere's position as High Commissioner. Frere wails, "I need not tell you that I came out to South Africa purely on a mission of peace. Had I foreseen the warlike troubles in which I have since been involved, I should have suggested to Her Majesty's ministers to look for some younger man." The facts of the matter were that Frere and Chelmsford had failed. The invasion of Zululand, conducted without the sanction of the central British government, had been repulsed. The Colonial Secretary, Hicks Beach, screamed that he had no telegraph with which he could have control of Frere, and doubted that he could have controlled him even if he'd had one. Frere asked for 2 brigades. Chelmsford wanted 1 Major General to bring the campaign to a speedy conclusion. Disraeli's government, stung into overreaction by the high profile these events in Zululand were enjoying in the press, reacted by sending out to South Africa 2 divisions and 4 generals. There would be no doubt this time. These reinforcements from Britain would take time to arrive. In the meantime, Chelmsford licked his wounds and contemplated his situation. Wood, with number 4 column, would have to fall back on and fortify a suitable position. Rowlands, with his number 5 mini column, would have to continue to see that the Swazis in the north would be kept out of the fray, and that the freebooter Mbilini Gamswati, who'd been active in the region, was kept in check. what was left of Glynn's No. 3 column, which had been smashed at Isandlwana, would have to hold Helpmekaar and Rorke's Drift. Durnford's No. 2 column had ceased to exist at Isandlwana. Pearson was holed up at Eshowe. Chelmsford would have to use whatever forces he had, supplemented by some early reinforcements to orchestrate the relief of Eshowe. On the 12th of March, 1879, the day brave Colenso preached his famous sermon, disaster struck again. A convoy of wagons coming from Leidenburg in the Transvaal, carrying provisions for Colonel Rowland's mini-column at Lüneburg in the north, was being hampered by bad weather. The wagons were held up at Meyer's Drift on the Ntombi River, which was in Spate. 2 of the 18 wagons had managed to reach the south bank, but the rest were stranded, and as darkness fell, Captain Moriarty, who had lagered the wagons poorly in the form of an inverted V with 20-yard gaps between the mouth of the V and the river, ordered the men to turn in. Moriarty of the 80th Regiment had failed to place outlying pickets. He had 71 men on the north bank. Lieutenant Harwood of the same regiment had been left with 35 men on the south bank. The mist came down in the night. In the pitch-black pre-dawn of the 12th of March, a shot was fired. Moriarty was woken up. He ordered the men to turn out, but fell asleep before the order was carried out. As it started to get light, 800 warriors were upon the camp on the north bank. Harwood's men joined the battle, firing across the river. This stimulated hundreds of Zulus to ford that river and attack him. Moriarty's men were speared as they came tumbling out of their tents in their nightshirts. Moriarty himself, having put up a tremendous fight, was speared while uttering the cry, "Death or glory, boys, I'm done." Harwood's force put up a spirited defense, eventually managing to fight clear of their camp, which was in chaos. They were hopelessly outnumbered, and Harwood, in possession of the only horse, decided to gallop off to nearby Lüneburg to get help. His plan worked, and Sergeant Booth and a number of his men were brought successfully back to Lüneburg. Booth got a VC, but Harwood was court-martialed for deserting his men. He was eventually acquitted, but Wolseley was dissatisfied, and the Duke of Cambridge ordered that Wolseley's remarks be read at the head of every regiment in the empire. This incident was to prove to be the precursor to another saga of desertion in the face of the enemy, which was to enjoy a much higher profile later on. The British public were horrified by another disaster, and Chelmsford was angered at the ineptitude that had characterized the Battle of Ntombi Drift, and embarrassed at the allegations of cowardice. As a matter of urgency, he would now have to relieve Eshowe, using the forces he had, supplemented with some early reinforcements. He therefore urges Wood up in the north to demonstrate, to keep active, which would ensure that the Zulus would have to deploy large numbers of their warriors in that northern region, which would of course take some pressure off Pearson besieged in the south. 20 miles from Wood's camp at Kambula, there lies a most impressive mountain called Hlobane. Hlobane is a flat-topped mountain 3 miles long. It forms part of a chain of mountains that rise up well over 1,000 feet above the surrounding country. Hlobane is the largest mountain in the chain. It is linked to the mountains to the east and west by razorback ridges 500 feet lower than the summit. The plateau of Hlobane is bordered by continuous cliffs, and the only access to the top is at the eastern and western ends of the mountain. It is a truly magnificent natural stronghold, and had been used as such for years by the Abakulusi clan of the Zulus. These were particularly aggressive warriors, and they had spent the early part of the Zulu War raiding at will in these northern parts. Wood and Redvers Buller, he of later Boer War fame, had long wished to drive the Abakulusi from this plateau, and Chelmsford's instruction provided the opportunity. The plan was that Buller would take the men of the Frontier Light Horse and other colonial units. They would move east from the camp at Kambula, give Hlobane a wide berth by moving well to its south. They would stop at nightfall and build up huge bivouac fires, and late in the night, having built up their fires, they would, under cover of the pre-dawn, scale the heights of Hlobane by climbing the pass up the eastern end. Having gained a foothold on the plateau, they would then drive the Abakulusi across the plateau to the western end, where another part of the British force would be lying in wait at the pass, later to become known as the Devil's Pass. Wood and his staff would arrive later, and be positioned on the lower slopes of the Hlobane, Wood having taken up the role of an observer. Buller's ascent of Hlobane was a nightmare. A pre-dawn thunderstorm broke over the pass, and Buller's men, leading their horses up through precipitous terrain, through long grass impeded by immense boulders and slippery clay, were exposed by brilliant flashes of lightning. The Abakulusi were lying in wait behind little breastworks of rock, which are still there to this day. They fired on the advancing troopers, but the men toiled on, horses crashing to their deaths, and the plateau was eventually attained only after Buller's men had suffered some casualties. As it became light, Buller moved onto a low ridge on the plateau. Zulus were moving around his flank, making descent down the route he had just taken impossible. They would now have to make for the Devil's Pass at the western end. A troop of the Frontier Light Horse made a stand on that ridge, which is to this day still strewn with their cartridge cases. Buller raced off on horseback to scout the Devil's Pass. He came upon a number of men under Captain Barton, Coldstream Guards, and he told them to move to the east, bury the dead, and leave the mountain. What a moment it must have been when someone tapped Buller on the shoulder and pointed out one of the most appalling spectacles imaginable. 5 miles away to the south, approaching Sloban, was a great dark shape. A huge Zulu impi was approaching. The morning sun was twinkling on 20,000 assegais. In the meantime, Wood had approached the eastern pass, moving along a terrace halfway down the slope of the mountain. He approached the pass which Buller was still ascending, and he found Colonel Weatherly and his border horse troopers looking for Buller. At this moment, Wood's force drew some fire from Zulus on the rim of the plateau above. His interpreter, Lieutenant Lloyd, was killed. Wood ordered Weatherly to clear the Zulus, but he balked at this, and Captain Ronald Campbell, Coldstream Guards, volunteered for the task, taking a couple of men from Wood's escort. Campbell was shot dead as he entered a cave, and Lieutenant Lysons and Private Fowler retrieved his body in a superb act of bravery that won both men Victoria Crosses. Wood, stunned at Campbell's death, buried the bodies of Campbell and Lloyd and left the field. As they made their way westwards along the terrace, they saw that huge Zulu army approaching. Wood told Lieutenant Lysons to take a most confusing instruction to Lieutenant Colonel Russell, that he was to get into position on the Zungwin Neck, which was construed by Russell to be 6 miles west of the western end of Sloban, which is what Wood had intended. Disaster now loomed. With that, the devastated Wood left the field and took no further part in the action. On the plateau, Buller watched in horror as the main Zulu army, now abreast of the centre of the Sloban, separated into 5 columns and raced for the base of the mountain. Buller sent a message after Barton, who was now burying the dead on the eastern end of the mountain. In this message, Buller told Barton to descend by the right of the mountain, by which he meant to the north. Barton hadn't seen the main Zulu army. He had met up with Weatherly, and together they descended south into the teeth of hell. They ran right into the jaws of the Ngobomakosi regiment. It was disaster. They clawed their way back to the neck, separating Sloban from the next hill in the chain, but the Abakulusi clansmen were in wait. 66 men died here, including Weatherly, who died heroically trying in vain to save the life of his 14-year-old son. Lieutenant Barton managed to get his horse off the north side of the mountain, but the horse was badly injured in the process. He nevertheless took another officer, Poole, up behind, and they headed north. Some Zulus noted that the animal was injured, and they patiently loped along behind. After 7 miles, the horse collapsed, and the 2 dogged officers were done to death. Over a year later, in May 1880, a warrior called Chichili led Brigadier General Sir Evelyn Wood to the spot. The 2 mummified bodies of these officers were found and were buried on the banks of the Manzana River, in a most beautiful and remote part of our country. These graves have never been found. Back on the plateau, the Abakulusi were spurred on by the sight of the main Zulu army. The fight on the plateau becomes desperate as Buller and his men are shepherded towards the Devil's Pass on the western side. The plateau on the western end of Sloban narrows to a point before dropping off in an incredibly steep razorback to the lower plateau. The Devil's Pass is today one of the most eerie and atmospheric spots of them all. It is difficult enough to walk down, using giant boulders as handholds. How anyone got off there on horseback is almost unbelievable. The story is taken up by the 16-year-old Chops Mossop in his lovely book, Running the Gauntlet. I looked down into the pass, and my blood turned cold. The pass was steep and narrow, choked with boulders. Zulus, crawling over the huge rocks on either side, were jabbing at men and horses. Some of the men were shooting, some using clubbed rifles. The man standing next to Mossop could face no more. He placed the muzzle of his carbine in his mouth and blew his brains out, spattering Chops Mossop, and in horror the boy threw the bridle of his gallant little pony warrior and plunged down the slope. He got to the bottom by some act of God, only to receive a stiff clout from Buller himself, and Buller told him to go back up and get his horse. So the plucky Chops Mossop picks his way up the pass, and sure enough the faithful pony warrior is waiting for him. But the pass was now choked, and the boy and his pony dashed for a gap in a cliff, and over they leapt. They become separated, the horse crashing and rolling to the bottom. Mossop himself was pinned momentarily under the body of another horse. He emerged from beneath the dead animal and dashed off to the slope below where Warrior, badly injured from his fall, was waiting for him. The saddle tree had broken, and the jagged iron would injure the horse's withers, so Mossop quickly packed his jacket under the saddle to protect the beast, and off they went, hobbling along the 18 miles to the British camp at Kambula, pursued most of the way. At least 200 men on the British side had died that day. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded, including one for Redvers Buller. Mossop took his limping pony to the horse lines, washed the horse's wounds, and gave him his rations, at which he only nibbled. The boy then collapsed on his blanket and slept the sleep of the dead. He awoke, stiff and bruised. He raced across to the horse lines to see Warrior. Mossop said the horse was lying down, and at first he thought him dead, but he was alive, just. The boy said he lifted his head onto his knee. He knew me at once, said Mossop, gave a pitiful whinny, shuddered twice, and died. He said, I laid his head down, and taking one of his small silken ears in my hand, caressed it gently with such a lump in my throat that had I not jumped up and run away, I would have blubbered right there in front of the horse guard. Only a little Basotho pony, but he had a great heart, and he loved me. The dawn was now breaking. It was the 29th of March, 1879. On this day, the day after Hloban, the tide of the Zulu War would turn at the Battle of Kambula. For the British, morning had come. The British learned from one of their spies that it was the intention of the Zulu army to attack Wood's camp at Kambula on this day. Wood had fortified his camp on a spur of a mountain. His wagons were lagered, and the centre of his position consisted of a small knoll, which had been converted into a redoubt. There were some difficulties with this position. Some folds in the country would provide cover for the enemy. At 11 in the morning, the Zulu impi appeared, over 20,000 strong, advancing in 5 distinct columns. Wood calmly allowed the men to finish their dinners, ordered the camp struck, posted the men, and opened ammunition boxes. At first it seemed as if the Zulu force would bypass Kambula and head for Utrecht, a town 25 miles away, and this was cause for concern. But Wood was reassured when it became obvious that the object of the Zulu attack was Kambula, and the great impi began to separate into the horns of the buffalo. The right horn of the Zulu army got into position and waited. Wood, anxious to get the right horn to attack prematurely, sent Buller out with 100 mounted men. The ruse worked, and the whole right horn sprang up and charged the party of horsemen. The horsemen escaped ahead of the charging Zulus, who sustained tremendous casualties as they came into the range of the British 7-pounders and Martini Henry rifles. The left horn of the Zulus then attacked the south of Wood's position, skillfully using the dead ground that a steep slope provided. They attacked with characteristic vigour and bravery, some of them shouting, "We are the boys from Isandlwana," and the British defenders had some anxious moments when the Zulus drove a company of the 13th Regiment from a cattle kraal with some losses. The Zulus then occupied a knoll to the west of Wood's camp, from which they proceeded to enfilade 2 companies of the 90th Regiment, blinding their officer, Major Hackett, and an impasse occurs. 3 hours of desperate fighting proved to the Zulus that they would not be able to cross the open space separating them from the British laager. Wood retook the cattle kraal, and the men of the 90th went forward to occupy the crest of some high ground, from where they fired down into the Zulus packed into the dead ground below. The Zulus wavered and fell back. Buller's mounted men took off after them. the defeat became a rout. With shouts of "Remember yesterday" and "No quarter," these mounted men, as the official narrative reads, smote down the fugitives almost with impunity, till darkness obliged them to desist. At least 2,000 Zulus were killed. Of the engaged British force of 2,000, 31 men were killed and 52 wounded. The lesson learned at Rorke's Drift had been applied this day. Lord Chelmsford in Durban now made an attempt in earnest, using reinforcements that had arrived from Cape Town, the Eastern Cape Colony and St Helena, to relieve Pearson in Eshowe. Pearson's garrison was in poor shape. 31 men, including midshipman Coker, had died, and 120 were sick. Chelmsford took command personally, and having carefully lagered his bivouacs all the way, he lagered a position near a stream at a place called Gingentlavo, or more correctly, Guinyentlavo, the place where the elephant was swallowed. The British later called it Gin Gin I Love You. Chelmsford's wagons were drawn into a square, each side being 130 yards long. His force was made up of 5,500 men. The 10,000-strong Zulu force attacked Chelmsford at 6 a.m. on the morning of the 2nd of April 1879. They attacked with great spirit and got within 20 yards of the wagons. One 10-year-old Zulu Udibi boy actually landed up unarmed inside the laager. He was promptly captured by a burly sailor and went on, believe it or not, to join the Royal Navy. The Battle of Gingentlavo was a short one. It was all over before 8 a.m. On the British side, 16 men died and 45 were wounded. The toll for the Zulus was heavy. 1,200 warriors died at Gingentlavo, many of them literally hacked to death with the newly issued sabres of the mounted infantry. That evening, Pearson was relieved, and the entire British force withdrew to the Tugela. Lord Chelmsford might have had reason to feel some elation. It was to be short-lived. Massive reinforcements began to come from the United Kingdom. Lord Chelmsford could now consider the reinvasion of Zululand. His plan was that he would attack Zululand with two divisions. One would move up the coast and the other would move north, meet up with Wood, who would retain his command over what would thence be called Wood's Flying Column, and these great bodies of fighting men would converge on Ulundi. Chelmsford would accompany the Northern Force or 2nd Division. You may remember from your history that Napoleon III was defeated in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, and he, his wife Eugenie, and their son Eugene Louis Jean-Joseph were living in exile in England, having been given succor by Queen Victoria. In 1873, Napoleon III died, and for many, Louis was potentially Napoleon IV. He enlisted at Woolwich and was trained as an artillery officer. He graduated well in 1879 with surprising success, but as a Frenchman he could not carry a British commission. On the 11th of February, the thunderbolt of Isandlwana struck Britain, and military establishments were hives of activity as reinforcements prepared to go out to South Africa. Louis desperately wanted to go. The Duke of Cambridge acquiesced, but Disraeli refused. Eventually, Eugenie asked Queen Victoria to intercede. So the Duke of Cambridge wrote Bartle Frere and Chelmsford a letter, informing them that the Prince Imperial was coming out to South Africa as a non-rank-bearing observer who would have to be attached to Lord Chelmsford's staff. This was, of course, the last thing Chelmsford needed. Louis sailed from Southampton on the Danube on February the 28th, arriving in Durban on May the 31st. Louis purchased a skittish grey called Percy from a colonial called Merrick Bennett. The prince was told the horse was wont to buck and rear, but Louis was a superb horseman, and Percy was just what he needed. Chelmsford reluctantly accepted him onto his staff as an extra ADC, and they headed north. In Pietermaritzburg, the Prince Imperial apparently set many a young female heart aflutter by vaulting into Percy's saddle from behind, using the wallet of the saddle as purchase, and slicing potatoes flung at him with Napoleon Bonaparte's sword. There is a hitching post to which he tethered Percy, still standing outside the Imperial Hotel today. When Louis arrived in Utrecht in the north, Chelmsford assigned him to Colonel Harrison, who was responsible for transport and the identification of a suitable route for the 2nd Division to take. Here, Louis comes into contact with Lieutenant Jaleel Brenton Carey of the 98th Regiment, who'd been in France in 1870. Carey could speak French, and the two got on well. Lieutenant Carey had in fact been promoted captain, but notification of this had yet to arrive in South Africa. Carey's maternal grandfather was Admiral Sir Jaleel Brenton, who had been British military resident at the Cape. The Simons Bay Cemetery near Cape Town contains family graves, and Brenton-on-Sea near Knysna is named after him. The Admiral had been one of Nelson's right-hand men at the Battle of Trafalgar. In the middle of May, Louis accompanied Redvers Buller's Frontier Light Horse on a lengthy patrol, crossing the Blood River into Zululand on the 16th of that month. He took off after some Zulu stragglers, and Buller was horrified and disgusted, and sought to be immediately rid of this responsibility. Louis did little to offset these feelings by strutting about, boasting about these antics, and wishing that he could be wounded in action. This put the fear of God into Lord Chelmsford, who issued additional instructions that Louis was not to be exposed to any danger. On Sunday, June the 1st, 1879, the 2nd Division was to move from Blood River to Telesi Hill. This move required some scouting 10 miles ahead. Louis requested Harrison to allow him to accompany a patrol into what was considered a Zulu-free area. Harrison agreed that Louis could go with an escort of 6 members of Bettington's horse and 6 Edendale contingent troopers. Lieutenant Carey presented himself at Harrison's tent, asking to accompany this patrol. Harrison assumed this patrol was to be accompanied and commanded by an officer, probably Bettington himself. At 9 in the morning on that fateful day, Bettington's 6 men reported. Bettington himself had to go off on other duties. These 6 men were accompanied by a tame Zulu. The 6 Edendale men failed to turn up at the correct tent. One must imagine the confusion in that camp. 5,000 men and all their impedimenta were on the move this day. The little patrol of 9 men set out, passing Harrison, who noted Bettington's absence and assumed Carey was now in command. Carey told him that they would pick up the Edendale men along the way. Major Grenfell shouted at Louis as they rode away, "Take care and don't get shot." The Prince replied, "Oh no, Carey will take good care that nothing happens to me." The Edendale men never turned up, and the patrol moved deeper into Zululand. At midday they reached the top of a conical hill, and they looked down into the Itiotiosi valley beyond. It was deserted. Carey indicated that it was time for a break, and they should off-saddle and make tea. Louis agreed, but insisted that they should descend into the Itiotiosi to a deserted kraal that he had spotted. There would be fuel for the fires there. Carey demurred, but then reluctantly agreed, and they made their way down into the valley. They got to the kraal, knee-halted their horses, and made coffee. It was an uneasy situation. Long grass and dried mealies, higher than a man's head, grew right up to the edge of the kraal. The tame Zulu immediately drew their attention to some freshly chewed imfe, or wild sugarcane. There was a dog skulking on the periphery of the establishment, and the ash of a hearth fire in a hut was warm. Carey suggested that they go, but Louis said no, 10 more minutes. This was to prove to be fatal. The tame Zulu reported seeing a Zulu moving over a nearby rise. Louis ordered the men to collect their horses. Minutes ticked by. The men were now standing at their horses, and Louis gave the order, "Prepare to mount." At this, the men had their left feet in the stirrups and were waiting for the command mount, upon which they would swing over into their saddles. As Louis cried out the instruction, "Mount," the kraal erupted in confusion as 30 Martini Henry rifles taken from dead men at Isandlwana fired into the patrol. It was an immediate state of sauve-qui-peut. Trooper Rogers, separated from his horse, raced around the back of a hut and was speared. Trooper Abel was shot and slid from his saddle. Louis was thrown as the skittish Percy reared. He raced after the horse and, grabbing hold of the wallet, tried to vault into the saddle from behind. But the wallet strap snapped, and he tumbled into the dust as the horse fled. Louis staggered to his feet. He felt for his great-uncle's sword. It had fallen from its scabbard. He drew his revolver and ran down a donga. He put his back to the wall of the donga and faced his foe. The others raced off through the long grass. In retrospect, it could be said that Carey fluffed the most magnificent chance of earning a Victoria Cross and saving his country some embarrassment by not rallying the men. They galloped for a full 800 yards before checking their horses. Obviously, nothing could be done, and the little band of horsemen started to head for Etelezi Hill. Fate somehow always plays its hand, and of all the men in the world, who should Carey meet on the way but two men who were braver than bravery itself, Evelyn Wood and Redvers Buller, both holders of the Victoria Cross. Donald Morris, that most masterful of authors, records the exchange as follows. Buller said, "Whatever's the matter with you? The Prince Imperial is killed. Where's his body?" Carey pointed at the valley behind, and Buller, searching the ground with his glass, saw half a dozen Zulus leading 3 horses some 4 miles away. "Where are your men, sir? How many did you lose?" "They are behind me. I don't know." "You ought to be shot, and I hope you will be. I could shoot you myself." They made their way to the camp. The news was reported to Chelmsford, who almost collapsed. Carey, late that night in the misery of his icy tent, wrote his famous letter to his beloved wife Annie.
My own one, you know the dreadful news ere you receive this by telegram. I am a ruined man, I fear. Though from my letter, which will be in the papers, you will see that I could not do anything else. Still, the loss of a prince is a fearful thing. To me, the whole thing is a dream. It is but 8 hours since it happened. The men all bolted, and I now fear the prince was shot on the spot, as his saddle is torn, as if he tried to get up. No doubt they will say I should have remained by him, but I had no idea he was wounded, and thought he was after me. My horse was nearly done, but carried me beautifully. My own darling, I prayed as I rode away that I should not be hit, and my prayer was heard. Annie, what will you think of me? I was such a fool to stop in that camp. I feel it now, though at the time I did not see it. As regards leaving the prince, I am innocent, as I did not know he was wounded, and thought our best plan was to make an offing. Poor boy, I liked him so very much. He was always so warm-hearted and good-natured. Oh, Annie, how near I have been to death. I have looked it in the face, and have been spared. Of course, all sorts of yarns will get into the papers, and without hearing my tale, I shall be blamed, but honestly, between you and me, I can only be blamed for the camp. I tried to rally the men in the retreat, and had no idea the poor prince was behind. Even now, I don't know it, but fear so from the evidence of the men. The fire on us was very hot, perfect volleys. I believe 30 men or more were on us. Both my poor despised horses have now been under fire. The one I rode today could scarcely carry me, but did very well coming back. Oh, I do feel so ill and tired. I long for rest of any kind. If the body is found at any distance from the kraal tomorrow, my statement will appear correct. If he is in the kraal, why then he must have been shot dead, as I heard no cry. Time alone will solve the mystery. Poor Lord Chelmsford is awfully cut up about it, as he will be blamed for letting him go with so small an escort. The Times and the Standard correspondents have been on to me for some news, also the Figaro. My own treasure, I cannot write more. Good night, my own one. I will try to let you know a few words tomorrow. I will now try to sleep till Reveille at 5 a.m., and it's now nearly 1, and so very cold.
The next morning 1,000 men left to find his body. It was found in the donga, naked but for a gold chain around his neck, and 1 sock with the initial N. He bore 17 wounds, all to the front. The one that killed him was, it was surmised, a great assegai thrust that had pierced his eye and come out the back of his head. His body was embalmed and began the long journey back to England, where it was eventually buried in Farnborough Abbey. A cross was erected on the spot in Zululand, on the instructions of Queen Victoria. Louis would have been proud of the inscription. It reads, "This cross is erected by Queen Victoria, in affectionate remembrance of Napoleon, Eugene Louis Jean Joseph, to mark the spot where, while assisting in a reconnaissance with the British troops on the 1st of June 1879, he was attacked by a party of Zulus and fell with his face to the foe. The British public were more stunned than they had been with the news of Isandlwana. Eugenie collapsed and remained semi-conscious for 2 days. The French accused the British of plotting the death of a Frenchman, and the only scapegoat could be found in Carey. Carey was court-martialed on a charge of misbehaviour in the face of the enemy. His defence was that Louis was de facto in command of the patrol. He was found guilty, but before the findings could be confirmed, the Empress Eugenie interceded. She said that she had no wish for any retribution and that enough sadness had occurred. The Empress's wishes prevailed, and Carey returned to his regiment. All Eugenie wished was for Carey to make a statement absolving her son from any responsibility for the deaths of Abel and Rogers. This would of course fly in the face of Carey's defence. He had made the point during his defence that Louis was giving all the instructions. He also drew the court's attention to the fact that had only the 2 troopers been killed, he doubted that he would have been on trial. Carey's wife Annie had, in an act of compassion, released Carey's letter to her, to the Empress. In that letter, Carey admitted that he was responsible for the bivouac. Eugenie now flew at him, and Carey was sent off to the northwest frontier of India, and he died under circumstances that have been subject to conjecture ever since. We know, however, that he was rejected and ignored by his fellow officers. When Carey walked into the mess, the others left their drinks unfinished and walked out. Such was the lot of one who'd brought the regiment into disrepute. Donald Featherstone concludes his remarkable book on this debacle with this most moving paragraph. Thus closed the career of Jaleel Brenton Carey. Jaleel, from the 3rd son of Zebulon, the tribe of whom in the rapture of triumph sang Deborah, they were a people that jeoparded their lives unto death in the high places of the field. No such paean sounded over the grave of this luckless staff officer. His lot was not the lot of Zebulon, but of Sisera. The stars in their courses had fought against him. Even at his death, the Army and Navy Gazette was still his champion. Captain J. Carey, 98th Regiment, of unfortunate history in Zululand, has, we regret to hear, died under mysterious circumstances in India, a victim of much persecution. The Empress came out to South Africa on a pilgrimage that found her on the 1st of June 1880 on the spot where her son had died. She met one of the Zulus who'd killed her boy, who gave her an appropriate rendition of what happened, highlighting Louis's bravery. She insisted that she be left alone, and with a candle for company she prayed during that cold black night that she would receive a sign from the soul of her boy, acknowledging that he knew she was there. There was a rustle at her feet, she said, but there were no leaves. And then the flame of her candle burned parallel with the ground, but there was no wind. Eugenie was satisfied. She died in 1920 at the age of 94. By May of 1879, the Anglo-Zulu War had become an acute embarrassment to the British political hierarchy. The British press were raising those very relevant questions. Who were these Zulu people? And why were we fighting them? Disraeli was being harangued in the House by William Ewart Gladstone, the grand old man, who demanded to know what the crime of the Zulus was. While it was true that after the indignity of the defeat at Isandlwana, Lord Chelmsford had had some success at Kambula and Gingendlovo, he was being crucified in the newspapers, and the government and the British people had made it clear that their confidence in him had diminished. It was therefore decided that Lord Chelmsford should be superseded by a man with military experience, administrative experience, and knowledge of this region. That man was Sir Garnet Wolseley, a brilliant military commander who was idolized by the British public, and a man who, in 1875, had enjoyed a brief spell as Governor of Natal. The decision that Wolseley was to supersede Lord Chelmsford as Commander-in-Chief was announced on May the 26th. As it happened, Wolseley reached Natal long before the announcement did. Sir Bartle Frere learned of Wolseley's imminent arrival by telegram, and this news was passed on to Lord Chelmsford, and the news had the effect of galvanizing Lord Chelmsford into action. The second invasion of Zululand had started, but it was proceeding awfully slowly. The 1st Division, under the command of General Creelock, was moving along the coast with a methodical plod, meticulously fortifying every bivouac, and going so slowly that these men ended up with the inevitable nickname of Creelock's Crawlers. Lord Chelmsford's staff officers, ever loyal, were now conscious of the fact that Lord Wolseley would try desperately to get to the front before the inevitable Battle of Ulundi, so that he could take battle honours. They would have none of this, and the race for Ulundi begins. Wolseley tells Chelmsford in a series of clipped and offensive telegrams that he objected to the separation of the two divisions, and he wished them to unite. Wolseley arrived in Durban, rode to Pietermaritzburg, and after a meeting with the military authorities there, concluded that nobody knew exactly where Lord Chelmsford with the 1st Division was. It would therefore be too much of a risky business to try to get to Chelmsford, and Wolseley decided to take the gamble of trying to get to Creelock on the coast. He would do this by riding immediately to Durban. He would board HMS Shah and race up the coast to Port Durnford, where he knew supplies were being landed through the surf. He does this, but on arrival at Port Durnford the weather changed and a landing was impossible. Wolseley had no choice now but to journey back to Durban and to try to ride up the coast to catch up with Creelock. He sends more messages to Chelmsford, trying to stall that 2nd Division's advance. Wolseley gallops up the coast. He arrived at the low drift on the Tugela on the 5th of July to be handed a copy of Archibald Forbes's famous telegram. The Zulus had been smashed the previous day at the Battle of Ulundi, and the Anglo-Zulu War was over. There is evidence to suggest that the king of the Zulus, Cetshwayo, had never really understood why his country was invaded. The Zulu victory at Isandlwana had horrified him, because he knew that all the overtures that he was making for peace would be met by the rebuttal that peace could only come now from the barrel of the .450/577 Martini Henry rifle. As Lord Chelmsford and his 1st Division got nearer to Ulundi, so did Cetshwayo's efforts to stay his execution become more pathetic. He sent the Prince Imperial's sword, and later 100 of the precious all-white royal cattle. The warriors of the Umqicho regiment were so outraged at the handing over of this national treasure that they drove them back to Ulundi, saying that they would rather die than be party to this. Chelmsford descended from the sacred heights of Mtonjaneni into the Valley of the Kings. He fortified a position on the White Umfolozi River called Fort Nalela. He sent sorties across the river, one of which was pounced upon by the Zulus. Cecil Darcy and Sergeant O'Toole bravely rescued Sergeant Fitzmaurice, and Trooper Robenheim was captured by the Zulus. The following night the British were tormented by the screams of Robenheim. He had apparently been handed over to the Zulu women, and they were now torturing him to death. On the 3rd of July, Colonel Buller crossed the White Umfolozi with the Frontier Light Horse. His mission was to scout out a suitable spot on the Mahlabatini plain opposite for the coming battle to be fought upon. Mahlabatini is a huge plain, and at this time it was flanked by huge military kraals. Buller found a slight rise which he deemed to constitute a suitable position, and this was duly reported to Lord Chelmsford. The next day, July the 4th, Lord Chelmsford crossed the White Umfolozi River with well over 5,000 men. He formed the men into a hollow rectangle, with men in the sides being in fours, and this great formation moved northeast towards the Royal Kraal, being escorted by the mounted men. On reaching the slight rise found the previous day by Buller, the rectangle wheeled half right, stopped and faced the Zulu capital 1.5 miles away. The Zulus, who had gathered in numbers on the heights surrounding the Mahlabatini plain, began to descend, and the mounted men outside the rectangle were soon under attack and forced to retire within the formation. The formation included 12 guns and 2 Gatlings, and the guns, having now been limbered up, were fired into the Zulus. The Zulus, to their everlasting credit, continued with their advance. Their numbers were estimated at 20,000, and they were soon within musketry range. Zulus were equipped with firearms, and they fired at the concentration of British soldiers, and if their use of firearms had been more expert, they might have inflicted heavy losses. Lord Chelmsford remained in the saddle, which action ensured that his officers did likewise. He was not in laager. He was not entrenched. His men were out in the open. He was going to prove his point on this day. The Zulus managed to get within 30 yards of the square. The fact that they did is absolutely remarkable, but it would take more than Zulu bravery to break this British square. They wavered and retired. Chelmsford gave the mounted men the order to go at them, and Colonel Drury Curzon Drury Lowe gave the order to his 17th Lancers to charge, but as he gave the instruction he was struck by a spent bullet and slid from his saddle. One of the great lance charges in history takes place with the officer commanding lying in the dust. Drury Lowe was only slightly injured. He managed to catch his mount, and in due course caught up with his men. The Lancers lanced the Zulus into the hills. The 9-pounders were then limbered up, and the Zulus on the heights were soon dispersed. Some shells were hurled into the Zulu capital, which was then burned by the mounted men. The rectangle moved forward to the Mbilani stream, where the men rested and dined. 1,500 Zulus died this day. 12 British soldiers were killed. In a 90-minute battle, the 63-year-old Zulu Empire was destroyed, and the greatest sub-Saharan army ever to raise Africa's dust was no more. The Zulu king fled off into the hills to the north, and Lord Chelmsford left the smouldering ruins on the Mahlabatini and headed for the heights of Mtonjanene. He resigned his command and handed over to Sir Garnet Wolseley, and Chelmsford made plans to return to England as soon as possible. After the Battle of Ulundi, Cetshwayo made his way off into the remote, forested region near the upper reaches of the Black Umfolozi River. Sir Garnet Wolseley, who had since sent an uncharacteristically generous telegram congratulating Lord Chelmsford, now had the difficult task of capturing the king. The British began scouring all the hills and valleys of this difficult terrain, and of course this episode excited a great deal of interest in the newspapers. The Anglo-Zulu War was one of the first campaigns in British military history to be well covered by the media. A race to capture the king began to develop between Captain Lord Gifford and Major Martyr, and I regret to say that the British stooped to un-British methods to obtain information. Zulus were tortured, and ordinary people were manhandled, but they kept their secret, and the king slipped through the net time and time again. Eventually they caught him. It was August the 28th. He had eluded his captors for 7 weeks. Cetshwayo was exhausted, and various British spies obtained information that he was seeking refuge in a remote region of the Ngome forest. Major Martyr's men surrounded the humble village, and Martin Oftebro, son of Ormond Oftebro, the missionary of Mpande, Cetshwayo's father, crept up to the hut in which the king was suspected to be, and whispered at him through the thatch, using a plain name that they had used years before when they were kids. Oftebro's anguished description reads like something out of Julius Caesar. The king must have recognized me immediately, for he said,
"Was your father a friend of mine for so long that you should do this to me?"
I must admit that I felt somewhat embarrassed and attempted to explain to him that I was merely doing my duty. At any rate, he made no further comments and followed me out of the hut to where the other men were waiting, and was promptly ordered by the officer in charge to prepare to travel. It was pitiful to see this once great man as he was on that day. He looked utterly exhausted and could hardly walk. Always a stout man, the insides of his thighs were chafed raw with walking and running. This was pointed out to the officer, and he ordered a horse to be saddled up for Cetshwayo to ride. But when the huge charger was brought up, Cetshwayo shook his head and said,
"I would sooner die here where I stand than ride that great horse."
Oftebro went off into the forest. He must have wept at what he'd done. They began the march to the coast. Cetshwayo asked the officer in charge of him, Captain Poole, Royal Artillery, if they could stop at the Coward's Bush, which still lives today, so that he could explain to his people the story of his uncle Shaka, of how Shaka would try all those warriors charged with cowardice at this bush. An assegai would be inserted 1/2 inch between the accused's ribs. If he flinched, the executioner would push it in all the way. If he didn't, he would be immediately released and given cattle. Cetshwayo started to display some unease when he noticed that they were moving more east than south, and his worst fears were realized when they came over the rise at Port Durnford, and there was Her Majesty's ship Natal waiting at anchor. They were going to do him the ultimate indignity of taking him by sea. Cetshwayo walked out across the beach towards the longboat in the surf. All Zulus have a mortal fear of the sea, but this man, every inch of him a king, showed not a morsel of fear. He was dressed in a traditional Mucha loincloth and a damask tablecloth. Hardened soldiers who'd fought one of the toughest colonial campaigns that had produced the huge defeat at San Luana and 11 VCs in one action, said that the hardest moment of them all was when that great king stood at the gangplank, looked back for a full minute at the green hills of Zululand that he'd fought so long and hard to preserve, shook his great head, sat down in the longboat and looked out to sea, never once glancing back. So much for Frere's savage king. They incarcerated him at the castle in the Cape, where Captain Poole looked after him, and they became friends. Poole was taken from him to fight the Boers in the First Boer War. He was killed at the Battle of Lang's Neck in 1881. When they told Cetshwayo of Poole's death, he collapsed and refused his food. So much for Frere's bloodthirsty tyrant, poised on the Natal border, ready to sweep everything civilized and British into the sea. But the British government changed, and Cetshwayo in many ways becomes the darling of the British. Celebrities passing the Cape were taken to see him and were impressed by him. He was visited by Prince Albert and Prince George, later King George V. His captivity was made comfortable. They put him in a house arrest situation on a farm called Oudtshoorn on the Cape Flats. His comrade in exile was Lang Alibalele, old Longbelly, who'd given Durnford that run for his money in the Bushman's River Pass all those years before. Cetshwayo was kept informed of the situation in Zululand by the Kalenzo daughters. As Wolseley's plan for the partitioning of Zululand into 13 little chiefdoms collapsed into a disastrous civil war, Cetshwayo hears how his people, stripped of their cattle and massacred by his cousin and rival Uspepu Gamapita, were given no protection by an ineffective British resident. He becomes resolved to return to Zululand and requests the High Commissioner Sir Hercules Robinson to petition Queen Victoria that he, Cetshwayo, might be able to present his case for repatriation personally to Queen Victoria. Robinson was successful, and plans were laid for Cetshwayo's journey. Cetshwayo departed with some of his followers on board HMS Arab on July the 12th, 1882. One of his wives later bore him a child, which was named in memory of this great journey. They called him Manzolwantle, the water of the sea. That boy became a great chief in our part of the world. There is a cairn to his memory on the Malagata mountain opposite my farm, to which we add a stone whenever we pass by. Cetshwayo arrived in the Plymouth Sound on the 5th of August. He was taken to see the Queen at Osborne on the Isle of Wight. She was thoroughly impressed with him and instructed her ministers that they should make provision for his return. He was taken to London and stayed at 5 Melbury Road, just off the old Brompton Road. Cetshwayo drew onto the streets of that great city some of the greatest crowds of human beings that city ever saw. They came to see the king, who thrashed a modern British army at San Luana. The visit was not without its light moments. Lord Granville, Colonial Secretary, took Cetshwayo for a walk through Hyde Park. They walked along the Serpentine, and when they got to the statue of Achilles, Cetshwayo asked Granville what the statue represented. On learning that it had been erected in honour of the great Duke of Wellington to commemorate his victories in Europe, Cetshwayo turned to one of his chiefs accompanying him and remarked,
"You see, it was not so very long ago since they fought as we do without clothes."
There were also moments of deep reflection. After Cetshwayo had been shown around the royal arsenal at Woolwich, he remarked to General Gage, who was acting as his guide,
I feel that I have grown up, so to speak, in a day, that from the childhood of understanding, I have suddenly sprung to manhood. I shall have a great deal to report to my nation when I return, for which I shall hardly be able to find words. But I have seen the might of England, and the goodness and kindness of the English nation.
Dear God, when you think of what we had done to him and his people, that he, in this moment, could come up with this most marvelous statement of reconciliation is indeed a lesson for us all. Those words could well have come from the lips of our beloved State President Nelson Mandela. Cetshwayo's return to Zululand was not a happy affair. Civil war had erupted and Zulu was fighting Zulu, as Lord Wolseley's plan of divide and rule ran its awful course. After much procrastination, Cetshwayo arrived at Port Durnford on the Zululand coast on January the 10th, 1883, and was reinstalled as king of a kingdom that was 1/13 the size of his original territory. He died on the 8th of February 1884 near Showe. He was probably poisoned by his arch-rival Usbepu Gamapita. At the request of Cetshwayo's family, no post-mortem was ever performed, and the official report reads that Cetshwayo died of a fatty degenerative disease of the heart. The manner of his death will always remain a mystery. After much official dithering, the British allowed him to be buried in a remote area in the Nkandla district near the Marme Gorge, in one of the last great refuges of the Zulu nation. It is an interesting fact to contemplate that after the Battle of Ulundi, the Union flag did not fly over Zululand. Sir Garnet Wolseley implemented his plan for the settlement of Zululand. Zululand, now stripped of the military threat the British had feared, was divided up into 13 blocks of territory, inappropriately administered by 13 inappropriately appointed kinglets. These chiefs had to report to a British resident. Wolseley completely disregarded the agreement reached by the Boundary Commission in 1878, and he excised all the disputed territories and gave them to the Transvaal. One must remember that the Zulu nation was forged by a process of bloody conquest, and when the superstructure that held it together was threatened, it was predictable indeed that the nation should dissolve into its composite parts. Even the House of Shaka was made up of great factions. Cetshwayo's faction, the Usuthu, had become all-powerful in 1856 when Cetshwayo destroyed his brother, Buyazi, and his 20,000 isiXhosa supporters at the Battle of Indonda Kuzoka. Wolseley used these old enmities to make sure that the Zulus as a nation would never become a threat again. Cetshwayo's cousin and great rival was Usbepu Gamapita, who had successfully curried favour with the British immediately after the Battle of Ulundi, and he was given a huge territory to the north, and the white chief of Zululand, John Dunn, who'd sold his friend and benefactor Cetshwayo down the river, was given the most productive and fertile region of them all. Cetshwayo was in exile, and his son Dinuzulu was too young to rule, and so Cetshwayo's brother Dabugu was now running affairs on Cetshwayo's behalf. Spepu, a grandson of Senzangakona, Shaka's father, had a complicated agenda, and his Mandlakazi faction constituted a major threat to the Usuthu clansmen. Cetshwayo's closest family members found themselves placed by Wolseley within the territory of Usbepu, and were put to menial labour. Cattle were raided, tilled fields were ruined, and Zululand erupts into the most horrific conflict. I have spent many hours talking with old Zulu people on this period of history. If one makes the request to an old Zulu that one would like to discuss the Zulu War, an old Zulu will immediately start talking of the Battle of Msebe, or Chaneni, or Ondini. If one should then interject that one wished to talk of the Anglo-Zulu War, about the battles of Isandlwana and Ulundi, the old Zulu will invariably say,
Cha mfana, yimpe encane yamangisi noZulu.
"Oh no, my boy, that was just a little fight we had with the British. At the Battle of Msebe, 4,000 warriors on the Usuthu side lost their lives. Faced with defeat and exasperated by the unsympathetic attitude of the British resident, the Usuthus turned to the land-hungry Boers for help. The British had never recognized Dinuzulu as the heir apparent to the Zulu throne. The Boers recognized him, and in fact crowned him king on the 21st of May 1884. They offered him military support, and Uspepu was defeated at the Battle of Cheneni in June of 1884. But there was a quid pro quo. 300,000 acres of land were claimed by the Boers as payment for this help, and the hamstrung Dinuzulu allowed the Boers to stake out their farms in areas that included the sacred Valley of the Kings. The conflict was not over, and the understaffed British resident eventually successfully appealed to the British government that Zululand should become a British protectorate. This comes about in 1887. The conflict continued further. The British officials continued to favour Uspepu, and eventually the Usuthu leadership went into open rebellion against the British authorities. Dinuzulu, Ndabugu, and Chingana, another brother of Tshetswayo's, handed themselves over to the British officials in Pietermaritzburg late in 1888 on the advice of the Kalenzos and hoping for a fair hearing. They were tried in 1889 for high treason and public violence and sentenced to long terms of imprisonment on St. Helena Island. The British then tried with some success to settle the differences between the Usuthu and the Mandlakazi, and a more peaceful situation resulted. The rains came regularly, and the cattle got fat, and the people prospered. Natal became a self-governing colony in July of 1893. A series of natural disasters then struck the Zulu nation. First, in 1895, came a plague of locusts which destroyed all crops in Zululand. This was followed by a drought, and then in 1897, the terrible epizootic of rinderpest which had swept down the eastern side of Africa reached Zululand and wiped out almost every beast. For a nation that counted its wealth in its cattle, this was the heaviest blow. During this period of hardship, the British were considering the repatriation of Dinuzulu. Dinuzulu must have been the most remarkable man. On St. Helena Island, he was befriended by many people. He learned to read and write. He had an interest in music and learned to play the piano and the American organ. It was decided that Dinuzulu could return to Zululand under the conditions that he agree to take up a position of government induna and advisor, for which services he would be paid. A house would be provided for him at Eshowe for this administrative purpose. In 1897, Zululand was incorporated into the British colony of Natal, and in January of 1898, Dinuzulu returned to Zululand and was installed as government induna. Dinuzulu, however, had no wish to stay in Eshowe, and he returned to his Usuthu headquarters, and his links with the colonial authority became more and more tenuous as his visits to Eshowe became less frequent. Storm clouds were on the horizon as the century closed. The Boers and the British became engaged in the Second Anglo-Boer War, which lasted from 1899 to 1902. Both sides agreed that the indigenous people of this country should be kept out of the conflict, but it was inevitable that this be impossible. In a confusing incident, Dinuzulu's warriors without proper sanction raided a Boer wagon and seized some firearms. The Boers, as a consequence, took to raiding Zulu cattle and burned down some villages. The Abakulusi Zulus retaliated one night, falling upon a Boer commander at Holkrans, killing 56 burghers. This incident did much to heighten the profile of Dinuzulu amongst the Zulu clans. He moved back to the site of the homestead of Jama, grandfather of Shaka. He rebuilt it, giving it its old name, Nobamba. After the Boer War, the position of the Zulus deteriorated further. At the time of Zululand's annexation into Natal, it was stipulated that the existing system of land tenure would be maintained for 5 years. This 5-year moratorium came to an end in 1902, and the highly fertile unreserved lands on the Zululand coast were distributed by the colonial authorities without the Zulus being given any compensation. In 1904, the old warrior Uspepu died, and with his death, the ever-present threat of civil war between the Usuthus and the Mandlakazis diminished. This further strengthened Dinuzulu's hand. the Natal colonial government decided to hold a census, which for some strange reason was perceived by the Zulus to constitute a threat. Suspicious of all officialdom by this time, they wondered why these officials wanted to know how many of them there were. After some years of plenty, in May 1905, a hailstorm, the worst in living memory, destroyed all crops and killed livestock, and resentment festered in this situation of hardship, and chieftains were turning more and more to Dinuzulu for leadership. Undertones of anti-white sentiment were becoming palpable. Across the region, Zulu families began killing all their pigs and white fowls. In the post-Anglo-Boer War depression, the coffers of the Natal government were empty, and the authorities doubled the existing hut tax. The Zulus countered this by crowding themselves into bigger huts. They were also aware that they were drawing little benefit from the taxes they were paying. This powder keg was ignited by the introduction of a poll tax of £1 per person for all people. This was met with open defiance. There were sporadic incidents of violence and killings. Rebels were executed publicly, and after an incident near Greytown in April of 1906, in which the petty chieftain Bambata Zondi attacked a posse of Natal mounted police, much of Natal and Zululand erupted into what was later called the Bambata Rebellion. It was ruthlessly crushed by the colonial military. The rebellion ended at the Battle of Morme in May 1906. Morme was the last great refuge of the Zulus, and in this gorge Bambata and his rebels were pinned down and massacred. They were shelled with artillery and machine-gunned with Maxims. The old Zulus will tell you that Bambata never died, but the official accounts tell us that his body was found in the gorge, and his severed head was taken to the magistrate at Nkandla and positively identified. Dinuzulu was arrested and charged with complicity in the rebellion. Circumstantial evidence did more than suggest that he had a hand in these affairs. He was found guilty, tried, and sentenced to another term of imprisonment. It was a travesty of justice, but Dinuzulu was not to serve much of his sentence. He was assisted by the advent of the Union of South Africa in 1910. The first Prime Minister was that military genius Louis Botha, who had given General Redvers Buller such a perplexing time at Colenso and Spionkop in the Boer War. Botha was kindly, a man blessed with unshakable fairness, and he remembered his old friend Dinuzulu. It was Botha who had fought with Dinuzulu against Usibepu. One of Botha's first acts was to see that Dinuzulu was released forthwith. Botha bought him a farm, and Dinuzulu settled with his family and advisers on the farm Uitkyk near Middelburg in the Transvaal. He had but few days to live. He was a broken man, and he died on the 18th of October 1913. He was buried at Nobamba, alongside the graves of his illustrious ancestors in the Valley of the Kings. After all the things we did to these people, one may well ask the question, why are they so well disposed towards us? Why are they so forgiving? Why are they so Anglophile? I have spent my life contemplating those questions. A senior British diplomat in southern Africa spent much of his time with me. He would go walking with my great friend and confidant Mzonja Mpanza, and they would walk into the extremely remote area south of my property. They went on many of these trips, and they would invariably return with the same stories of Ubuntu, of the hospitality and kindness of this most hospitable of all people. Those people living in remote villages, living in their old and elegant way, would give them everything they had. They would hear the Zulus shouting from the hills to their front, "What are these white people doing here?" And someone would shout, "Don't worry, they are British." The man would then shout, "Tell them to come and have some beer with me." This diplomat asked me why they are so well disposed. I had to admit that I didn't know. But I found this description of the capture of Tretchwayo in an obscure journal, and perhaps in this some of these answers lie. This piece is taken from the Zulu campaign by Major Ash and Captain Wyatt Edgehill. You will remember that Tretchwayo had eluded his captors for 7 weeks, and was eventually cornered in a remote part of the Ngome forest. This is how Major Ash remembered the moment. The king, it was subsequently learned, saw Martha, but he didn't see Gifford's men, and he considered that the cavalry could not approach without his knowing. But Martha had wisely taken off his saddles and made his men leave their steel scabbards, advancing only with numbness and naked swords, and then disappearing into the bush as if disappointed in his quest. The major stole up quietly by a circuitous route to the kraal and surrounded the king's hut. The native contingent were actually the first men up, as they were on foot and could move more rapidly than the horses. These fellows dashed at the kraal, saying to the king's attendants, "The white man is here, you are caught." Major Martha then rode up quietly to the king's hut inside the kraal and called upon Cetshwayo to surrender. The king said with a certain amount of dignity,
"Enter into my hut. I'm your prisoner."
Major Martha, however, declined this invitation and prudently invited the king again to come forth. This was the final picture. A Zulu kraal is perhaps a refuge with as little of the picturesque or dignified as any known habitation. Perhaps a harsh description. Yet the poor king, somewhat bloated in appearance, weak, footsore, and evidently sick at heart, came out of his refuge with a royal dignity which could not be surpassed. And when a too heedless dragoon tried to touch him, he said in grave and majestic tones,
"White soldier, do not touch me. I surrender to your chief."
Meanwhile, Lord Gifford, to whom beyond all doubt the capture was due, as he alone tracked down the quarry, galloped in, and the king expressly said that he surrendered to him and not to Major Martha. With haughty gaze and supremely regal though savage dignity, with his head erect and the mien of a Roman emperor, Cetshwayo marched between the two lines of the 60th Rifles to his tent, while the men, by the order of Lord Gifford, presented arms to him as he passed. Only the British would present arms to the savage king. Thank God they did. Such was the final scene of the Zulu War.